Hi, I'm Jill from Friends on the Block. In this video, I'm going to look back at the skills we've been focusing on in the last few videos that are all part of the stage I'm calling Preparing to Decode. Sometimes students can get stuck on some of these early skills, so I'll give you tips to help them get unstuck and some information about how to decide when to move on. This video is a particularly important one for us at Friends on the Block because we're talking about what to do when a child gets stuck and how to move them forward. And our goal at Friends on the Block is to help ensure that everyone, regardless of disability or circumstance, learns to read. This is the list of all of the skills that make up the Preparing to Decode stage. In our previous videos, we took these and did a video about each one of these. We did one on letter sounds, one on phonemic awareness, one on irregular words, and then another one on book reading that talked about the final three on this slide. In this video, I'm going to take these one at a time and talk about what can you do if a child is just not making much progress on a skill and they're getting kind of stuck. How do we get them unstuck? We'll start with letter sounds, and the objective for letter sounds is that the student is going to see the letter and then they say the sound. So if they see the letter S, they'll say S. If they see the letter T, then they'll say T. Very straightforward. There are a number of things you can do if a student is struggling to remember letter sounds. One is to be sure you focus on only a few letter sounds at a time, maybe 2 or 3 sounds at a time. Another one is to be sure that the sequence in which you practice and introduce these skills to students is one that minimizes confusion. For example, you wouldn't want to introduce 2 letters that look a lot alike very close together, like B and D. You would also want to do easier letters before more difficult letters. So the letter sound for the S, is much easier than the letter sound for W. That's much harder to make in isolation. Down here you see our sequence from Friends on the Block, but you may want to break it down in even smaller chunks. Another tip is to be sure to pronounce those sounds very clearly and stretch sounds that are continuous sounds, like the letter S. We go through this in a good bit of detail in the previous video. Another tip is to use an echo procedure for both correcting mistakes, but you can also use it for practice. This is that I, we, you procedure that I keep talking about. So for example, when you're practicing letter sounds, you can do them like this. Listen. Now let's do it together. Now you do it by yourself. And then you would go to the next letter and repeat that same process. Don't forget that as you add new letter sounds, as students are learning those sounds, that you continue to practice the known sounds. That cumulative review is vitally important. The main thing is to provide lots of very fun practice. So the kids are engaged and they're just getting a lot of practice in. Something else you can do is using very simple language, simple terms, draw attention to the way a letter sound is formed in your mouth. So you might draw attention to, my mouth is closed, where your tongue is when you make a sound. If you want a good resource for this, any speech language therapist can give you some assistance in helping explain to kids and show children how they're making those letter sounds. You can also use embedded mnemonics. By this I mean, for example, the letter S is actually shaped like a snake. So that word snake reminds them both visually of the letter S, and it connects to the sound because a snake says S. The beginning of snake is S. There's quite a bit of research on this topic. The recommendation is that you want to do this to teach those harder to learn correspondences. So basically, if it's a letter sound that the students are struggling with, you might want to add one of these embedded mnemonics. Some of the more difficult sounds would be the sounds for short vowels, also the consonants W, Y, and H, and the hard sounds for C and G. Is when you say the letter name C and the letter name G, you don't hear K and G. Instead, you hear their soft sounds, S and J. So if you're teaching those hard sounds, which are the most common and what we teach first, it can be helpful to use an embedded mnemonic for that. You can find links to more information about that research with this video. Now we'll move to the next skill, phonemic awareness. Again, there's an entire video about that, and I really do hope if your student is struggling with phonemic awareness, you'll watch that video again for some important tips. The objectives for phonemic awareness are blending and segmenting. It's all spoken, all sounds that you hear. It's not print. So at the earliest level, the student is able to blend the first sound of a word with the rest of the word. So if the teacher says sun, the student can put it together as sun. And then the opposite, what's the first sound in sun? S would be the answer. The next level, what's in Friends on the Block level 3, is doing that same thing of blending and segmenting, but you do this with every individual sound within a word. So if the teacher says s, n, the child is able to say sun. Or you can stretch and connect those even more, going sun, and then the child would say sun. And then the opposite of that, the student would segment. So if the teacher said the word sun, then they would say each of the individual sounds. So what are the sounds in sun? And the child would be able to say s, n. If you have a student who's really struggling with this, I would recommend that you check back with that previous video. Make sure you're following the sequence carefully and that you are stretching and connecting, as I did in the previous example, whenever it's possible to stretch and connect. One thing that is different about phonemic awareness is sometimes students aren't even able to copy you exactly. And when you're practicing letter sounds and you say this letter sound is s, the student, unless they have a speech issue, is able just to repeat s. But if you ask a student to tell me the sounds in sun, and even if you say sun and get them to try to repeat it after you, they may not be able to do that, likely because their short-term memory is not able to process those sounds and hold those for that long. So what you need to do here is accept approximations, accept their best effort. And then you provide lots of fun practice, but be positive and accept whatever they give you and keep on modeling. Another option is to focus on what is really the most important skill at this particular level, and that's identifying the very first sound in a spoken word. So just focus on what's the first sound in sun, and is the child able to say s? What's the first sound in mom? And is the child able to do that? And eventually you would say those words without giving them that hint or that scaffold at the beginning. What's the first sound in son? What's the first sound in mom? And while you're working on that, go ahead and do some practice with letters. There's going to be a lot more on this in upcoming videos because this is what we do in level 4 of Friends on the Block. So I'll have more in videos very soon about how to do this. The reason to do this is that the research is very clear that phonemic awareness and being able to decode or sound out words is a reciprocal process. You learn a little bit of phonemic awareness and that helps you learn some decoding. The more you learn with your decoding, the better your phonemic awareness gets, and it's one of those things that kind of cycles back and forth. It's reciprocal. One thing helps you do the other, and then the better you get at that one, the better you get at the first one. So it goes back and forth, and that's why adding the letters can help you. You want to continue to work on some sound-only work, but you can also do this with print. When you add print to phonemic awareness activities, you do have to be really careful about the words that you choose because you have to pay attention not only to the sounds but to the spelling. You want to make sure to choose words in which every letter represents its most common sound. You also want to choose words that begin with continuous sounds because those are easier. You don't want to choose only words with that begin with continuous sounds, but more of those. You also want to choose words that are meaningful to students. If it's a word that may not be meaningful all by itself, like the word in, then you might want to put it in a sentence. I've put some words down here that are examples of words that you can use for phonemic awareness activities with print. The next skill is high-frequency irregular words. The objective for this is super simple. The student sees a high-frequency irregular word, they look at that word, and they say the word. Now, remember that high-frequency irregular words are very common words that do not follow common phonics patterns, like the word friend. Some words are also considered temporarily irregular if the child doesn't know the phonics patterns needed to sound out that word. If a child is struggling at this stage to learn irregular words, there's some information that is important to consider in making decisions about what to do next with them. One thing to consider is this is an early alphabetic stage. And in this stage, students don't have the skills yet to analyze words. They are using some letter cues to identify words, but they generally aren't learning every letter within a word yet. They will be doing that very soon, and that's very important, but they don't have the skills yet to do that. And as they learn how to sound out words, so as they learn how to decode, they're going to learn irregularly spelled words more quickly and easily. So right now, you really want to focus on just a small number of words that help us at this stage for them to read meaningful sentences and even some books. It's important to choose words that can be put together to form simple sentences. In this way, the child is able to read a complete sentence and begin to learn more about the process of reading and reading for meaning. Once they've learned a few words, then you can add a few more words, but don't forget to keep practicing the first words that they've learned. That cumulative review is extremely important for students with intensive needs. These are the first high-frequency irregular words that you learn in Friends on the Block. So you can see our sequence here was done so we could put these words into sentences and write books using these words. You may be using different materials and going in a different sequence, but I would recommend that you look at coming up with a list of just a few words that you can combine into a sentence. The words in blue here are words that are made up of patterns that we'll be teaching in later levels. So they will eventually learn those spelling patterns. For now, they're not sounding out these words. They're reading them by sight. We are encouraging them to look at the letters. That is very important as you're learning any new sight words. I'm going to give you an example of some activities for that in just a minute. Be sure to follow the correction procedure consistently. Every time the student makes a mistake, you want to follow up and practice that word correctly. You would practice it as, this word is do. Say it with me. Do. Now your turn. It's also okay with this particular skill if you want to skip the we part of it and just do this as an echo. Listen, this word is do. What word? And this is a good way to practice too. If they're making a lot of mistakes, just do an echo for all your practice for a little while. And then pull away that echo and see how much they can do on their own. Practice reading the words in books if you have them and in sentences. Provide a lot of fun practice with individual words. You can do this by having them build words. They can look at a word. So if they see the word do, and then they can pull the magnetic letters to build that word. You can also combine the words into sentences and have them practice doing that. So one game that you might remember, we talked about shake and make. When you play shake and make, you just put the letters for a word. So you put the D and the O in a cup, shake it up. The child would shake it up and roll it out, and then they build the letter. If the student is really struggling a lot, you want to show them a model. So they can look at that word, you're going to scaffold that, and then they can copy it. So they're looking at every letter because they've got to build that word. Another activity is the super sentences. So you would have the sentences on cards and show them a sentence and then shuffle the cards and they can match the sentence. I discussed these last skills in the video on early book reading and comprehension. There are quite a few skills that you can highlight in this area, and here's a few of them. Students are learning to recognize those words in text, and they're becoming more and more accurate as time goes by. They're learning to read those words a little more quickly and also read them with expression. Even a very simple sentence can be read with expression by a child. So they can read the sentence, I do not like bananas. And they read that with expression that demonstrates that they understand what it means. For books that they're listening to, as well as books where they're reading a little bit on their own, or books like ours where they're doing a combination of the two, as the teacher reads part of it and the student reads part of it, it's important that they're learning to make predictions about what's going to happen next in a story, and you want to have them discuss the book so they can develop vocabulary, the meanings of individual words. They can comprehend both what they hear and what they say as they're reading on their own, and that they're able to express their ideas. It's important that they can learn how to retell a very simple story, the beginning of the story, the middle of the story, and the end of the story. You also want them to be able to demonstrate print awareness during book reading. This is why we stress that you want to point when you're reading. So have the student point as they're reading, particularly at this early stage. When they're pointing, you know that they are demonstrating an understanding of how what we say relates to the words on the page. All of these early book reading and comprehension skills develop gradually across time. As I just described to you, it's really important to have them point while they're reading, so don't forget to do that. You want to use echo reading when they need you to do that. So if your student is struggling with reading even the simple words you've been practicing, if they're struggling with reading these in text or in sentences, use an echo read. Use an echo read as long as they need you to use an echo read. And every now and then stop and see if they can do it on their own. It's extremely important that whatever you're reading, that you talk about it. You talk about it a lot. You want to engage the student in conversation. So you can explain some things, but then let them do a lot of that talking. As you can tell, there is a lot going on at this stage. As you're preparing to decode, a student is learning a wide variety of skills. They need to learn at least some letter sounds. They need to be able to isolate the first sound in a spoken word. So what's the first sound in sun? And that child's able to say S. They need to recognize a small number of some very common words. You need to make sure that they can point as they are doing reading, either in a sentence or in very simple books. Even if they need support, that's okay, but they need to be pointing as they read. These last two bullet points are both language oriented, where we're focusing on the meaning, and understanding the meaning of what we read is something they're going to be practicing and developing across a very long time. You could really argue their entire lives. So you want to see growth in these areas, that we're moving forward in those areas, but it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm not sure if I've used that word master or mastery yet, but that's really what I've been talking about, because you want to avoid a snowball effect where a student isn't learning those few sounds, you're adding more and more and more, and they're just getting more and more confused and not growing, that it becomes overwhelming to a student. This is particularly important for those discrete skills like letter sounds and the high frequency words. You do want them to master a few words before you start adding more. But it also doesn't have to be perfect, as long as you continue to practice those skills until they eventually become very proficient with those skills. And that's the second bullet point here, is that you need to recognize that these foundational skills require lots of cumulative review for a student to become truly proficient. Eventually, they need to recognize these letters and sounds and words automatically without conscious effort. They need to be able to do these things very quickly and effortlessly. One of the distinguishing characteristics between students who struggle and students who don't, particularly those with disabilities, is that students who struggle simply need more practice. They just need more cumulative review, and for some students it needs to be extremely intensive, but they eventually get it. You need to follow the needs of your particular student, and remember that some skills, and this can vary by student, but some skills require a lot more practice than other skills. So spend time on those skills where that student needs to practice a lot. One of the ways that we structured Friends on the Block a little differently than even other programs that I've written in the past is that we have developed it to have a very flexible style of mastery. So in level 1, you learn these 6 words. As long as you know about 4 out of these 6 words, you can go on and move to level 2. Now, during level 1, you're also practicing letter sounds. You're doing all these different skills that I've been talking about, but they don't have to be perfect because they're going to be practiced more in level 2. So there isn't anything in level 1 that isn't going to be seen again in level 2. So you want to make sure you don't get this snowball effect that you go too fast, but it also doesn't have to be perfect. As long as they learn most of the words in one level, they can move on to the next level. And they can stay in any level as long as they need to be in that level. In our research studies with Friends on the Block, we had some students who needed to read all 4 books in a level before they could move to the next level. We had other students who would read all 4 books and they needed to practice a little bit more, and we'd read one of those books again before we moved to the next level. So it varies from student to student depending on the intensity of their needs. In the video blog on getting started, I described this routine for a standard lesson where you do a quick warm-up introducing skills, then you spend some time reading in books, and then you spend some time playing a game or doing a fun learning activity. And that part 3 is where you spend the bulk of your time practicing really targeted skills. We use this lesson routine in Friends on the Block, and you can certainly use it with other materials. The way that we customize is by choosing games based on the skills the student needs to practice the most. So we can adjust what skills they're practicing depending on which game we choose to play in the 3rd part of that lesson. There are lots of great resources out there for teaching these skills and getting additional ideas of things that you can try. I will put some resources with this video. Reading Rockets is one I want to highlight. This book by Rollanda O'Connor that's pictured here is another one. The University of Florida Literacy Institute has lots of great materials on these particular skills. So I'll put that information with the video. Thank you so much for watching this video and our other videos. I hope that you are finding them useful for you and the students that you are working with. If you have, please tell others about us on social media, like us, follow us, share. Please subscribe on YouTube. That would be really great for us. Become a free member on our website. As I've told you before, we have 17 free e-readers. Now we actually have those as printables as well if you want to print those out. We also have some of our games on the free website and monthly giveaways. Consider making a purchase if that's something that you would find useful and you're able to do that. We have digital plans as well as physical products. You can buy our books and games separately or buy complete instructional kits. Thank you so much.